My name is Gail Jensen, and I'm the Dean of the Graduate School, our College of Professional Studies, and Vice Provost for Learning and Assessment here at Creighton. And we are thrilled to see all of you, and we are even more thrilled to have our Alumni Merit Awardee here this morning who's going to give a talk, General Anthony Zinni. And the introductions are going to occur in two parts. The first part here is going to be from Senator Charles Hagel, who has recorded something for us and is a very good friend and colleague of General Zinni. And then after that, I'll do a more personal kind of biographical introduction, and then you'll hear from our distinguished guests. So we're just thrilled to have you all here, and please have breakfast, and I guess roll it, right?
First, it's a privilege to be able to say a few words about General Zinni for many reasons. But let me start with this. Like many of you and all of our young people in the audience, throughout your lifetimes, you will meet very special people. People who you will judge first and should judge first by their character and their integrity. And that's where I start with General Zinni. This is a man of considerable integrity and character. The other dynamics of human beings and people and how we judge them are based on courage and ultimately judgment in every job they have, no matter how big or small. And he checks the boxes on all of them. When I was in the Senate, especially during the lead up to our invasion of Iraq, as well as right after the invasion of Afghanistan, for those years were difficult years following, and they still are, because we're there in both countries still, longest wars we've been in. Tony Zinni was an individual that I talked to often. There were three people when I was in the Senate during that time that I asked to come see me or I would get on the phone with. They never failed me and gave me very wise counsel. Tony Zinni was one of them. The other two were Zbigniew Brzezinski, who unfortunately just passed away a couple of months ago, and the third was Brent Scowcroft. These three men were of immense value to and have been for many, many years in their careers and their lifetimes. But you think about what Tony Zinni has done for our country. He rose to the highest ranks in the armed services. His career was one to be modeled after for all and every young officer, every young person. Self-effacing, humble. And I'm particularly proud that Tony Zinni chose Creighton to come back and get another master's degree, and is there to getting his doctor's degree, and participating in activities there, certainly at Creighton, but he enhances the whole community, he enhances the state just as he has enhanced everywhere, every place, and every one that he's been associated with in his career. So I congratulate Creighton for having Tony Zinni there. I congratulate Tony Zinni and the Alumni Association for honoring him tonight at the banquet. I'm sorry I won't be there, but this is to say to you, dear friend Tony Zinni, thank you for the service that you've given this country and continue to give to this country. I'm very proud you're a Nebraskan, and I'm very proud to call you a friend. Thank you.
I took 4 pages of biography of General Zinni, and I have it down to 2, but you really do need to listen to the breadth and depth of his contributions. General Anthony Zinni is a United States Marine Corps retired general and a former commander-in-chief of the United States Central Command. And of course, he's our 2017 Alumni Merit Awardee for Creighton University's Graduate School. He's originally from Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, a product of Catholic grade schools, high schools, and Catholic higher education. He's the son of an Italian immigrant and one of the first to go to college in his family. He has an impressive record across many areas, including military service and leadership, diplomatic and foreign policy experience, business leadership, academic lectureships, consultation and teaching, and public service. His military service includes deployments to the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, Western Pacific, Northern Europe, and Korea. He has also served tours of duty in Okinawa in Germany. His operational experiences include 2 tours in Vietnam, Operation Provide Comfort in Turkey, Northern Iraq, Operation Provide Hope in the former Soviet Union, Operations Restore Hope, Continue Hope in the United States in Somalia, Operations Resolute Response and Noble Response in Kenya, Operations Desert Thunder, Desert Fox, Desert Viper, Desert Spring, Southern Watch, and Maritime Intercept Operations in Iraq and the Persian Gulf. I'm not done yet, this goes on. Operation Infinite Reach against terrorist targets in the central region. He was involved in the planning and execution of Operation Proven Force and Operation Patriot Defender during the Gulf War, in the non-combatant evacuation operations in Libya, Zaire, Sierra Leone, and Eritrea. Military awards. General Zinni has been recognized with 23 personal military awards. Let me list just a few. The Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Meritorious Service Award, Navy Commendation Medal, Combat Action Ribbon, and personal awards from Vietnam, France, Italy, Egypt, Kuwait, Yemen, and Bahrain. He holds 37 unit service and campaign awards. In addition, he has been recognized with over 20 national-level civilian awards, including our recognition here at Creighton. General Zinni has participated in presidential diplomatic missions to Somalia, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the State Department missions, including involving the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts and conflicts in Indonesia and the Philippines, and he continues to be active in that area. He has worked in consultation with 18 academic institutions and other centers focused on global conflict and peace, as well as co-chair of the Center for U.S. Global Engagement National Security Advisor Council. He also has been busy in the business side. He has extensive business experience, has served on boards of major companies in the fields of government service, manufacturing, telecommunications, electronics, hospitality, hotels, and defense industries, software development, financial services, shipbuilding, mining, cybersecurity. I don't know when you sleep. Filmmaking, energy, engineering, design, and capital investment. And he goes to school. This is, he has an impressive record of lectureships with academic institutions across our country. Some of these include Duke University, Cornell University, Virginia Military Institute, University of California, Berkeley, Beloit, the Joint Forces Staff College, William and Mary, Villanova, and Old Dominion. In addition, he is a prolific writer of numerous articles, op-ed pieces, and monographs. He has 2 New York Times bestsellers, a co-authored book on his career with Tom Clancy entitled Battle Ready, and a foreign policy book entitled The Battle for Peace. He has written a book on leadership, Leading the Change, published in 2009, and a national security policy book, Before the First Shots Are Fired, published in 2014. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in economics from Villanova. We'll forgive him for that. He holds 3 master's degrees, a Master of Arts in International Relations from Salve Regina College, Master of Arts degree in Management and Supervision from Central Michigan University, and a Master of Science in our Negotiation Dispute Resolution program here from Creighton. He holds honorary doctorates from Villanova, William and Mary, and the Marine Maritime Academy, and he is a current student in our doctoral degree program in interdisciplinary leadership. We are thrilled to have him here. Please help me welcome General Zinni.
At this stage of your life, they all begin to sound like eulogies. I'm sort of, you're right up there. You may be in my will to be able to, but thank you, Dean. Appreciate that, and thank all of you for coming, and especially thank you for the honor that you're about to bestow on me. It's important for many reasons, but one most important reason, my 7 grandkids know I'm a student, and they constantly want to see my report card. So I'm able to maybe show them I'm getting an award from my school, which will impress them when I get home. I thought when we talked about things that I might talk about, I thought maybe I would give you an impression from what I'm doing now, work with the State Department, and what I've done in the recent past from my military career, an impression of what I think are the things that are driving the world we live in today, and maybe a little bit about the kinds of things I think we need to do to cope with some of the issues or problems that we face, and how they impact us and even our day-to-day life. I remember reading Henry Kissinger's series of books on diplomacy, and Kissinger talked about 5 reorderings in modern times since the Peace of Westphalia, but particularly in the last century, 3 major reorderings. The world reordered itself after World War I, after World War II, and then after the Cold War. And it's very interesting how we, our leadership in the United States, approached each of these. And I think it's a good lesson to draw on the different ways you can look at a world that's in upheaval or changing for some reason or another. You remember from your history at the end of World War I that President Wilson very much had a vision or view of how this new world order coming out of that horrible conflict should be shaped. You know, he had his 14 points, his League of Nations. He really thought some of the old models, colonialism, imperialism, should go by the wayside. We should now collectively look at how we deal with challenges to our international security. And of course, he wasn't listened to. I mean, it personally crushed him, and it affected his health, and he was a beaten man. We could not convince our Congress or even the American people at that time that we should be engaged and try to shape the way the world was headed. And we paid a big price for that. Our isolationism at a moment when we could have stood up to that leadership really helped contribute to the causes of what led to World War II. At the end of World War II, and this is probably my favorite period in history, because I think in terms of Americans, it was the greatest period of true strategic thinking and a true step up to assume the mantle of leadership. That period from 1944 to about 1950, the kinds of things that we did to shape the world probably got us through the Cold War era without it becoming a hot war. And it changed the way the world viewed leadership, cooperation, and the way we should go about resolving our issues. During that period, we did things like, of course, the Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of Europe. The Marshall Plan, when it was first announced, only had 19% approval rating amongst the American people. And George Marshall gave 84 speeches to convince Congress and the American people that we should adopt a different approach, where the losers don't pay reparations, but in effect, the winners help the losers reconstruct and form a better world that's much more peaceful and interactive and cooperative. The same thing was happening in Japan with MacArthur and the way he shaped the government. And again, when MacArthur was relieved of command by Truman and he left Japan after being there for 7 years, 1 million Japanese lined the streets and were in tears when he left. We also, at that period of time, had the 1947 National Security Act, where we restructured our government, created the National Security Council, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, other things that modernized and shaped and streamlined our government, but were more reflective of the world out there. We supported and helped build the United Nations, the creation of NATO, the International Monetary Fund, the World Banks, Bretton Woods. We managed to get all our currency, or most of the currency of the world, on some standard. If you look at what went on economically, politically, in terms of security during that short period of time, it was strategically really a first in the history of man. And we led the way in all that. Surprisingly enough, it was during a Democratic administration, Harry Truman, and a Republican Congress, whose relationship was far worse than we see today. And yet, Representative Vandenberg, who might have been at least a nominal leader of the Republicans at that time, and Truman and Marshall came together, put political views aside, and did all these things that shaped us and put us in a position to weather all the storms that were ahead, including the Cold War. So where are we now? The Cold War ended 27 years ago. What happened then? If you listened, I was in Germany when the wall came down, and it was a tremendously interesting time because no one knew what we were going to do. We heard from Gorbachev and President H.W. Bush talk about a new world order, that there would be a peace dividend, but nothing seemed to be happening. There weren't these kinds of measures being taken. There was no strategy. There was certainly relief that the Cold War had ended. And I remember first arriving in Germany just as Gorbachev and the Western powers had suddenly realized the war was over, the Cold War. And basically, nothing marked this. There wasn't some sort of big announcement or treaty or anything. Everything just stopped. When I arrived there, I was supposed to get briefings. I was a new brigadier general. There were about 5 or 6 of us reporting for duty. And the briefers told us, we don't know what to tell you. All our briefs we've been given for decades. We're in Berlin, the Berlin Brigade. No one knows what the rules are and what's happening. And we had an Army second lieutenant who was sort of escorting us around. And he said, how would you guys like to go into East Berlin? And we said, can we do that? Are we allowed? And we were all in uniform. He said, nobody knows. Nobody knows what the rules are anymore. And he had this Volkswagen van. It looked like something that was rescued from a hippie commune, piled us into it, and we drove through Checkpoint Charlie. Now, for most of you in this room, Checkpoint Charlie may vaguely be remembered as something back in the history of the Cold War. To those of us that lived through it, this was the pointy edge of the spear. This is where the Iron Curtain was. This is where the wall was. This is where communism and Western democracy faced off against each other. And as we went through Checkpoint Charlie, we realized nobody was there, on our side or their side. And we drove through into this East Berlin that was on the main drag of facade. It looked modern until you drove off the main highway. And you still saw the pockmarked bullet holes from World War II. People driving around in 50s vintage bicycles. Those Eastern German Trabi cars belching fumes and driving around. We just came from West Berlin with Audis and Mercedes and BMWs. And the contrast was severe. We drove around for a while and we came across a Russian concern, a Russian base. And the lieutenant said, let's drive in here. We said, can we do that? He said, no one knows. And we drove in. And the sentry didn't know whether to shoot us or salute us as we drove through, so we just kept on going. But coming out of that really impressed me that something significant has happened, and being a student of history, I thought we will do something significant about it. In other words, we will take measures somehow to make sure that we don't snap back into the Cold War, or that whatever is going to self-organize or self-structure in this world order, that we will try to influence it, so it's positive. But nothing happened, and that's what was the greatest shock. Right now, if you're in a Pentagon or you're up in the State Department, when you read the documents that kind of describe usually the intelligence estimates as to what kind of global environment we have now, they use the terms volatile, unpredictable, complex, and ambiguous. You know, it is an environment that really looks like nothing we've experienced before for a number of reasons. We're trying to cope with it. And I think, a personal opinion, the biggest deficiency we have is we've lost our ability to think strategically. We no longer create the Marshalls, the Kennans, and the people who thought that way. Recently, in the last string of presidents we've had, each of them, when asked about this, have sort of shuffled it aside. You know, President Obama said, I don't need Kennans. And President Bush 41 said, oh, the vision thing. You know, we're not worried about that. And I could give you other quotes, whether they're Democrat or Republican in leadership in Congress, where strategy and thinking through, having a vision, being able to implement it, is no longer valued. And we have since become a transactional nation. We do things day to day. And that kind of leadership mode has washed over not just in government. Unfortunately, I've seen it in the military with few exceptions, and I could say many of the exceptions, thank God, have now risen to government, and people like General McMaster's and General Kelly and General Mattis. But I see in business the same thing. Make my numbers, get me to the next quarter. You know, that's the theme. The number of CEOs that fail are just atrocious. Fortune 500, about a third don't make it, you know, beyond 3 years. In the non-Fortune 500 companies, CEOs last on average 18 months. So we're losing top leadership. many people that follow the kinds of skills or talents it takes to lead are appalled at the low percentage of true strategic thinkers. I saw some statistics from Harvard and elsewhere where the percentage of those that are really seen as strategic thinkers, visionaries, and those able to implement strategic plans that come out of those visions, as anywhere from 4 to 9% of our leadership across the board, which is scary. You know, and what kind of world are we in? I think one of the things that would worry me most right now is this sort of middle of the road we have placed ourselves in to decide whether we're going to be engaged collectively or we're going to fall back to a greater sense of nationalism, individualism, more bilateralism, and less cooperative ways of dealing with issues. If anything's emerging as a Trump doctrine right now, I would say this withdrawal from multilateral either economic agreements or agreements on the environment or elsewhere, a move toward more bilateralism, and we have to question ourselves, will that work? Globalization has run rampant. There's been good things that come out of globalization, bad things, no attempt to really make sure we try to capitalize on the good things and take care of the bad things. So where are we headed? When you look at Brexit, you look at the moves that China and other nations are taking, we're seeing this sort of retrenchment back into nationalism, less emphasis on collective or multilateral approaches to our problems. And I think that's going to hurt us in the long run. We've seen the UN's credibility fade, the credibility of organizations like NATO fade considerably. And so what does this mean? If we're going to go back to be a bunch of individual sovereign states trying to work things out that way, it will not address the problems that face us because the problems are borderless right now. There's been a greater redistribution of power. So despite the fact that obviously our nation has been blessed to be as strong as it is economically, militarily, or whatever, there are very few things we can do on our own. I think everybody acknowledges that. The distribution of power is not bifurcated into two camps, East and West, anymore. With the rise of nations like China, like India, and many others that are on the cusp, we're going to see the need now to obviously work more closely together because no one has enough power, enough clout to be able to deal with the problems we face alone or just in ones and twos. We are looking at several things that I think are driving the world today. The first is, and I describe this a lot differently than anybody else, and I would describe it as the transformation of the Islamic world. I've spent the last 3 decades of my life mostly in this world. And it's easy to focus down on what a small number of extremists are doing. It's easy to declare war on terrorism. Terrorism is a tactic. Imagine if President Wilson declared war on U-boats, or President Roosevelt declared war on kamikaze planes. That's in effect what we have done, which in effect tells me we don't know what this phenomenon is and we don't know how to deal with it. It is a very small part, although obviously a critical one because of the violence that's perpetrated, a very small part of something greater that's happening. Where 1.6 billion people are going through a transformation, and in some cases doing it well, in some cases having trouble, in some cases handling it horribly or suffering greatly because of it. But we will go through an historic period that may last 25, 50 more years as this major portion of our planetary population gets through and figures out how it's going to adjust to modernity and bring its traditions and values in some way that shapes its ability to do that. Other societies in history have gone through that. And to understand this, I would recommend a book called Destiny Disrupted by Tamim Ansari, which is called The Middle History, the history of the Islamic world, because you want to understand where they are now unless you understand what their path through history has been. And it's critically important because we do understand Western history and Eastern history, but very little do we invest in understanding what's happening, and therefore we have difficulty understanding what's going on beside what draws our attention, which is the violence. I think we're going to see great economic changes. We have fragile economies around the world, but they're not in third world areas or fourth world areas. We're now seeing fragile economies in the developed world. The southern tier of the European Union could be in great trouble, Greece and other places. And what happens when we start to see the collapse of major economies, or we see a collapse of economies from developed world? We haven't really experienced that before in any major way. And that's troublesome, especially as you see these cooperative economic agreements and arrangements beginning to fall apart. We're seeing a growing number of failed states and sanctuary states for bad things. I spent 3 tours of duty in Somalia. I've spent a lot of time in Yemen, and it is amazing to watch a society completely collapse. You know, when you think it is reached a point in civilization where all its institutions can't fail at the same time, but they do. We're many places in the world where we're down to 1 or 2 institutions that are credible. I once talked to a consultant for international banks, and he was paid a lot of money because he had tremendous ability to predict collapses and problems to allow the banks to withdraw their investments. And when I talked to him about how he was so prescient, he said, I look at the institutions, you know, government, business, corporate world, military, whatever. He said, when I see a country get down to 2 that are viable, I sound the alarm. If they're down to 1, definitely pull your money out. And when you look around the world, there is a whole number of places that we can look at countries and societies that are at that point or headed toward that point. And that can be troublesome because the disruption and the instability tends not to stay within borders. And I think the whole idea of borders needs to be challenged because most of the things that affect us are borderless, you know, and will wash over. The old idea that geography was the paramount way you structured your security around, behind mountains and behind rivers and over oceans, completely gone in what we face now. We also have had another phenomenon in the last decade that no one's paid much attention to. Within the last 3 or 4 years, we have crossed a milestone in our species, Homo sapiens. We are now more urbanized than not. More human beings live in cities, 60% of us, than live outside of cities. Now, the first question we have to ask ourselves, how does that work? Is that good? Is that bad? Why are we now clustering and migrating to the cities? Is it because we've destroyed the environment and it can't sustain us outside the cities? Is it because there are no opportunities other than to try to go into the cities and find work and be able to sustain our families? And then the second question has to be, can those urban areas and cities sustain us? I mean, I listened yesterday to our president talk about the need for infrastructure development and investment on our part. We have the youngest cities in the world. There are cities out there that are millennia old, and can they sustain these growing populations? And when you see these cities explode, in many places I've been in the world, you're starting to see health problems. You're starting to see instability generated from people that are out of work. You're seeing demands on the infrastructure that can't be sustained. There are several cities in the world where their aquifers can no longer support them, like Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, or the aquifer in Gaza. 2 million people will have no usable water. You know, as a matter of fact, it's less than 1% of the water on this earth is usable, and it's actually going down. And our means of being able to sustain a population, you know, with just the basics, let alone trying to do it in overpopulated urban areas, is going to go greater. We now have 6 going on 7 billion people in the world. In 2030, we will have 9 billion people. You know, where does the planet become unsustainable? Where does the population get too big? And can it be sustained in the current models, one of which is living basically in cities? And so can an urbanized global population be sustained in the long run as it grows? And it's growing in all the wrong places in terms of sustainability. The other thing that's changed our world is one you're well aware of, that most of you in this room are native to, and I'm an immigrant of the first order, and that's information communication technology and social media. You know, one of the things that made me feel really great is when my 12-year-old granddaughter said, "Grandpop, you're the smartest man I know." And she said this to me while she was fixing my computer. And so I realized, you know, we are generations apart, little wise ass, but, you know, I just thought, This is the era that I am not that familiar. I wasn't born with it, and I had this discussion with one of my grandsons, who's 13 years old, about why my way of life, the social interaction, which was more one-on-one, more personal, was much better than his, which is all in some sort of technology based. And he was trying to convince me his was much better and much more complete. And it provided much more information and interaction and 24/7 communication. Yeah, I shook my head too. He won the debate, though, I got to tell you, and he and his little buddies. But this is a different world, and so there are people my vintage making decisions on that environment. The third most populous nation in the world is Facebook, and soon will be the most populous. What does that mean? This connectivity creates a different identity, a different relationship. It is certainly borderless, and it has affected everything we do. We're worried about our elections, and can somebody from outside affect our elections? Obviously, the probe now into what the Russians might have done, but that's just a small tip of what went on. How credible is information? How credible is the news we get? What are the sources? Do we check the sources? Do we like news in our own flavor that we prefer? And what does that do about credible information on which we can base decisions on how we're going to run our lives? Also, one issue that has personally consumed me is the environment. How in the heck we can politicize science and the environment. You'd be shocked to know how many generals and admirals have been screaming at our Congress and others about the importance of dealing with climate change and other environmental issues, because we have seen the direct impact on national security and international security. And we have to deal with it. It is happening. We're going to have an Arctic Ocean that's going to be transportable and navigable. We are going to see certain climate zones change, maybe change from temperate to subtropical or tropical. What happens to agricultural resources, health issues that are created? As I mentioned, we're seeing glaciers melt, aquifers go away, aquifers becoming saline. This all leads to instability. And we're not dealing with it. We're in denial. The deniers tend to make the policy decision, although the vast amount of people and scientists have certainly come over and validated this. I participated with 11 other four-star generals and admirals on a study. And we looked at this not only in terms of what would happen, in terms of climate effect, but also how this drew down to affect directly our national security interest and the instability in places of the world we have to operate. And it gets little attention. We have also tried to convince our policy leaders not to cut the investments we make in soft power, in diplomacy, in keeping our State Department viable, in economic aid, and USAID and other agencies. There are 180 retired 3- and 4-star generals and over 30,000 veterans that through the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition have lobbied the Congress not to cut State Department funding, which is drastically being cut in personnel too, because those other soft power elements are needed as much as military power. And you will see somebody like General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, has said, you cut the State Department's budget, you better buy me more ammunition, because you have not allowed me to resolve issues and mitigate them without ending up resorting to military force, which is always the fallback, and often too much. And those of us that have seen it try to sound the alarm on this. I think another area that we have better pay attention to is the the education competition that clearly many around the world see and we don't. I think if you went to China and India, you would see clearly they see the future in educating their youth and investing in education. And we have not done that. I'm a career student, as the dean pointed out, 74 years old Sunday, and I'm still packing my books and going to school. You never stop learning, but more importantly, you invest in education. It's your future. That's our seed corn. And we have a model in the way we educate, which can be the subject of a whole nother talk, that is absolutely broken. It is centuries old in the way and methodology that we teach. We made education unaffordable. We have not provided an equal level of education for every member of our society. And this, to me, is probably the biggest investment we can take, certainly in times that we describe as volatile, unpredictable, complex, and ambiguous. You know, in the long run, that's where you invest. There's an old saying in the military that when your budgets are cut and you can't afford the equipment and you can't afford the other things that make up a military, you never cut education and training, because in those times you create the leadership you need that will get you out of that and get you through it. It saved us in World War II with men like George Marshall and others that had that kind of vision and understood it. I think we have to do several things to fix many of these problems. One is we need to relook at our international and regional organizations, and we need to revamp them. The United Nations, for example, is a reflection of the post-World War II era. It doesn't reflect the world today. In the members of the Security Council and what its authority is, we need to invest in better international security organizations that deal with all the problems that we face, not just security problems. We need to rebuild alliances. Alliances like NATO are insufficient to meet the needs today. And the better the alliances and the stronger the alliances, the better. I actually felt when the wall came down, if we were going to keep NATO, we should have invited Russia into it. Because the best way you deal with a potential enemy is co-opt them and bring them in. And they were willing to do it at that time. We were actually connecting to their military. I was spending a lot of time in Moscow with their military leadership. We also had State Department members working with their government to bring them more into international cooperation, making their monetary units more clear, transparent, and equal to the rest of the world. And all that went by the wayside. All we succeeded in doing is taking all their former allies, dumping them into NATO, and creating a situation where their sense of nationalism was risen and a person like Putin could take over. We need to develop soft power, and we need to develop more of it. We need to, in effect, invest more in our diplomats, invest more in our economic aid and how we apply it around the world, invest more in dealing with issues like climate change and the environment that are going to come and wash up on our shores eventually. We do need that investment in education. And most importantly, what I would finish with is we need to invest in building strategic leadership, strategic thinkers in every aspect of our society, in business, in government, in the military, in our education systems. We've lost the art. And it was a time not that long ago where we led the world in that type of thinking, and led the world not only because of the blessings we have in resources and other things, but we led because we were providing the vision that people like Wilson and Jefferson and others, left us. We have somehow fallen back from all that. And I think that this is going to be the most important step we can take, investing in education and cultivating and building strategic leaders. Thank you very much for attending this morning, and thank you very much for the honor that I've been given here. Be glad to take any questions that you might have too at this time. And I think Martha's got a microphone and she'll come to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
That was a wonderful talk. I want to get your thoughts. A few years ago, I had lunch with a former senator who was resigning, and part of the reason he said things in Washington that aren't getting done is because of social media, which you talked about. And you also talked about our strategic leaders not developing enough strategic leaders and becoming transactional. And he said a lot of that has to do because of social media and the immediate need for answers because we're a get-it-now society, stating that in years past he would be able to meet with a Republican, talk about legislation, and put something forward, whereas today, if he were to meet with somebody from the other side, he would have phone calls and emails from his constituents saying, why are you meeting with them? And when things happen, our media expects our president, whoever it might be, to have an answer right away. Do you think our need to have an answer now has led to the reduction in strategic leadership?
I do, and I think there's many aspects of that harm our ability to process decision-making and strategic direction. You know, Madison said, had the press or the media been invited in or had visibility in the development of the Constitution, we would have never had a Constitution. And, you know, the reason for that is sometimes while you're thinking through things, you can't be free to express and put on the table things that you might not necessarily see would be the ultimate option you would take, but you need to think it and flesh it out. You know, we hear that constantly all options are on the table, and immediately there's a microphone in front of let's say the President or Secretary of State or Defense saying, does that mean the military option's on the table? Well, yeah, maybe it is now because we haven't really done the analysis on options. Well, when are we going to take military action? And why are we taking military action? And the headline reads, President decides on military action. And maybe it's just because in the beginning, in the initial way you go through the process, you have to look and go through each option. Although you fully realize that there are certain options that won't happen. You know, there's some classic studies in this, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Kennedy had all options on the table. Unfortunately, some of those options did leak out and did get most attention because he had to be prepared for a potential nuclear war. So that planning had to go through. But it was Kennedy's full intention to avoid that in any way possible while still achieving the objective of getting the missiles out of Cuba. And he wasn't helped. Certainly by members of the military either. Bombs away LeMay kept saying, now's the time to do it, let's go, you know. And he's saying, that's exactly what I do not want to do. How do I get the mission accomplished without going to that level? Eisenhower went through the same kinds of things. So this is a tough environment because not only social media, the ability of the media to penetrate your processes, the leaks that come out by those around you that we see, however intention they may be, end up making it more difficult to process these things before you obviously open them up to transparency. Now, there's also blame on the other side. You know, we have seen decisions made that were our justification for increasing troop strengths in Vietnam and adding ground forces was on a hoax, on the Tonkin Gulf incident. And so when that was released in the Pentagon Papers, it's validated, you know, the ability of, and the justification for leaks and for media putting out what were classified material. So in some cases, when what you're about to do is not credible and it's not, you know, I think legitimate in many ways, that creates part of the problem too. It is a fact of life though. And so you have to be able to operate in this environment. It's an interesting study on how presidents and administrations have made decisions in the past. We have had presidents that rely on single source advice, where the Kissingers and Brzezinskis and others dominate. We have others that have used their full cabinet, others that have just used their National Security Council, others that have created aside little groups that provide their ability to analyze and help them in decision making. Eisenhower did it with his Solarium group and a number of others. Every president has chosen a different way. In the case of President Bush 43, the decision to go in Iraq was made without a complete set of advisors who could give him the downsides of what he was about to do, and a very small group labeled the neocons had the greatest level of influence through the Secretary of Defense and the Vice President, and so fewer options were put on the table, lack of a complete view of what the consequences were. So, I mean, the short answer, it's life as it's going to be from here on out, and decisions are going to have to be made through some process that accounts for that. Other questions?
Captain Boris, sir. I work for Creighton Army ROTC. I instruct the sophomores. You talked about borders, and this kind of piggybacks off that question. Rosa Brooks has a book out, How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything. In it, she posits that the military is becoming increasingly an option that's on the table, not only kinetically but non-kinetically, as far as like soft skills and things like that. What's your opinion of the military doing jobs that maybe formerly would have been done by Greenpeace or USAID or Doctors Without Borders, things like that?
Great question. You know, the military now, because we have limited those other investments in soft power, we have used the military to do these things. As many combat operations I've been on, I've probably been on twice as many that were humanitarian missions, security missions, peace missions, disaster relief, that sort of thing. And the trouble, the military is very useful in the initial phases. We are very good at emergency response. We bring a lot of capability when a tsunami hits or a hurricane hits, but we are not good and shouldn't be used, and unfortunately we are, at reconstruction. We have been made to govern in some cases. We have been made to reconstruct institutions in society. You know, when we went into Somalia initially, President Bush had made that decision after he lost the election. It was purely out for altruistic reasons, because the Somalis, because of man-made problems and drought and climate issues, were dying in the hundreds of thousands. And we went in to provide security so the NGOs and the UN could provide the sustainment that society needed. Well, when we came in and assumed the control of the security, guess what? We assumed control of everything because there were no other institutions. And we found ourselves, I became the chief of police in Mogadishu, literally. I have a chief of police uniform. We were running their court systems, their prison systems. You know, they were looking to us to reconstruct the government. And when I say we were wearing, the camouflage uniforms. We are not expert in that. You know, like all good soldiers, we will do what we're told. We'll take on the mission, and we'll do it enthusiastically. But are we the right organization to reconstruct governments, economies, security systems? I don't think so. But there's nobody else that ends up doing it. And we get put in to resolve the emergency and then get left there because there isn't anything to follow on to allow that to happen. And in many cases, what ends up happening is it gets screwed up, not because we intentionally did it, because we did not have that level of expertise. That's not what I was and you are trained for, you know? I mean, I see that 2nd Division patch there, you know, and so obviously, you know, you've seen those kinds of missions on both sides and what they've done. And in my mind, the military is the wrong organization for the long-term reconstruction of a society. And I go back to that should be an international requirement too. It shouldn't only be a handful of countries or the U.S. alone that should make those determinations.
John Langdon, a longtime student, far back, and just wanted to thank you for an incredible perspective, and also thank Creighton for the continuing support, because I can remember when Harry Truman himself stood behind a podium just like this decades ago. But in an era when we're now faced with rogue nations that are already nuclearized to some extent, I don't know, I'm sure we have a better idea of what's going on than is put forth. But with the depletion of diplomatic resources and the increased emphasis on potential catastrophic solutions, just wondered what your thoughts are on how things like this could be playing out, and the ability to bring in much bigger players like China to help resolve these issues in a diplomatic way.
You know, one of the interesting things about the times we live in now that gives us great difficulty is the many-faceted relationships we need to have with each other, nations. It used to be clearly you're either with us or against us. We famously have a recent president that said that, you're with us or against us. That's not the way the world works. It works where sometimes I'm with you and sometimes I'm not. So we now have to view our relationships either as strategic partners, strategic competitors, or strategic adversaries. And unfortunately, you may have to look at a nation, let's take China, in all three. And that becomes much more difficult. There are times when, let's take China again, we want to partner with China in dealing with North Korea. We want to partner with China on the environment. We're going to be competitors. We're certainly economic competitors. And we are adversaries. Their expansion in the South China Sea, which we object to, we face off. We run our freedom of navigation operations. They project and build their little islands out there. So this is very confusing for our leadership. A couple months ago, I had a major effort to try to convince our government, this is the last administration, that we should stop punishing Egypt for certain violations of human rights, because the way we were punishing them is denying them military support while they were fighting a three-front war against terrorists and extremists. What we haven't figured out is, let's take the issue of human rights in this case. That's very important. It's very important to us. If you're not living up to the values of human rights as we see them, we need to do something about it. But what we often do is we then go over to another relationship we have, in this case, strategic cooperation, and we are going to punish you through that. For military people, this is often frustrating because we're often required to build a military or help build a military that looks like ours, that has the same set of values, is responsive, is used in the right way. You could be successful in that while that same government and its police and other things are committing human rights problems and issues, or creating them that we don't agree with. So we go over and break something that's working. You know, we did that to Pakistan. You know, we punished them through our military-to-military relationship, even though that was critical to us. We're paying a big price for this now, and we did in Afghanistan. We did it in certain African countries where the military rose up and actually was performing in a much more credible and value-based way because of our influence, our training and education of their officers, our involvement. But because we didn't like what the government was doing, or the police, cases like Kenya, we ended up cutting off military support. So in this very complex world, we haven't figured out how to deal with two relationships or three or four relationships that seemingly are at odds, and how we need to manage them on different tracks. I always go back to World War II. Who were our allies in World War II? Joe Stalin, a communist. Winston Churchill, an imperialist. Chiang Kai-shek, a warlord. That was an interesting collection. I mean, we had some human rights issues going on, but we had a strategic need that overrode that. Not that we shouldn't have brought that up, not that we didn't object to their forms of government or how they approach the rest of the world, you know, but we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. That's not the way our politicians normally think. It has to be black and white. It has to be, you're either with us or against us, as the famous now line went. Okay, well, no other questions. Thank you very much. Oh, one more.
Could I draw you out a little bit more on the issue of education and what you see as some of the issues that we confront that diagnose the problem and maybe some possible solutions?
Sure. Well, let me just take a few. One is student debt. I mean, why are our students, if this is an investment in our future, why are we allowing our students to take on unbelievable, unmanageable debt? Why credible, quality, recognized school teachers that are out there, that we can't move to the next level and fund their advanced degree so that they can become the future assistant principals, or move up the next level of education? So cost of education is one approach I would take. To me, and I keep wanting to come back to this term, investment. If you view education as an investment in your future that affects everything involved in your future, your economy, your security, your governance, and everything else, you take a whole different view. I would rather my taxpayer go to that, and my taxpayer money go to that than maybe some of the other things we spend on. Obviously, we need to, I think, relook the way we teach. You know, the way we teach, even the time of year we teach and don't teach, you know, which is based on an old agrarian concept. With generations that really need activity, interaction, more than they need lecture. I had one of my granddaughters, her family went to Australia for 3 years because my son-in-law was working. His job took him there. And their 3 children, they were told, after 3 years when they came back, they would be behind and have to catch up in the school system where they were going in Pennsylvania. When they came back, they were ahead of everybody in their class. And so this really interested me. I'd visited them out there several times, and I was really interested in their schooling. 90% was interaction or activity. It was interaction of some sort. All the teaching went through activity, almost all of it. It was a whole different approach to education. What my 3 grandchildren found here when they came back, this inactivity, was really something I had difficulty dealing with. There was more left for students, even at their ages, to do. There was more ways of teaching that allowed them to experiment and do other things than it was basically sort of rote learning and imparted. You know, based on my wonderful course with Jackie, I learned about the effectiveness of listening and just hearing words. You retain about 10%, you know, and is that the best way to teach? I was involved in, where I live in Williamsburg, Virginia. Colonial Williamsburg, I was on a board of trustees, but we bring school teachers in from all over the country, and we run programs, particularly those that teach history and civics. And obviously Colonial Williamsburg, where a lot of our founding fathers developed the ideals that we operate under and govern, but they teach also new teaching methods. And they use some of us as props, you know, where they're teaching how to bring in people that represent oral history. And in the case that they used us for the teaching the class with the Vietnam War. You realize you're really old when you're part of ancient history. But they actually brought in those that had protested during the war, those that had gone off to Canada, those of us that fought in the war, and they learned how to conduct an oral history interview, get the students to ask questions, you know, read about it, know about it beforehand. But those are small things, but it's a different model than just sort of, well, now it's History 101, now we're going to teach you about the Vietnam War. So I'm saying that there are innovative ways we can remodel how we run our system of education. Should we, based on this long summer hiatus from education of some sort, should it be year-round schooling? What are the advantages? How do we handle the issue of student debt? How do we take the facilities and the structures and make sure it's everybody in our society has access to it, that not just the more wealthy parts of our society, inner city schools and that sort of thing. How do we encourage teachers, especially those that are doing really well, to move on in their profession, educate themselves, and reward them for doing that in some way? I can see a program where if you're a great teacher and we want you to move and get your advanced degree in that and move on, that our government would fund it and you would owe us X number of years on your contract. I understand that concept being in the military, but I'm just saying we ought to open up our whole aperture toward more innovation in education and what we need to do. We got to get away from this school ain't cool mentality that we have out there. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.